What is up, producers? Welcome back. If you've learned about compression a million times and it's just not connecting, this video is for you. This is going to be the last video you're ever going to have to watch about compression. Compression is one of those things that I learned over and over again, and it really took like some explaining and some comparisons for me to really like internalize how to actually use it. So this is the simplest way I could ever explain compression, and this should be the last video you'll ever have to watch about it. Before we begin, I have some terrific news. I've been building out this course for the last year, a complete start to finish electronic music course. I've been producing music for 10 years. I have 3 music degrees, and I literally condensed all that and made it into one super fire course. It's super affordable. It's $100. If you're a subscriber, it's $50, so it's half off. And trust me when I say it's everything you're ever gonna need to know in 30 days. So if you're interested in that, it's gonna be linked in the description. With that being said, let's hop into the video. Compression really is one of those things in music production that can really separate your music from something that might sound amateur to something that sounds professional. Compression is going to be one of your most used tools in your toolbox, and if it's done right, it's going to completely change the quality of your music. So what is compression? Compression is essentially volume automation. So what it does is it decreases the dynamic range of your sound, or the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts of your sound. So basically what that means is when you're compressing something, what you're doing is you're turning down the loudest part of a sound, typically so you can turn everything back up. That way you have a smaller range between the quietest part of your sound and the loudest part of your sound. And again, it's one of the production skills that separates a professional producer versus a novice. And compression is a multi-tool. So there's a bunch of different ways you can use compression, which we will go over shortly here. So even though I knew what compression was, and the thing is a lot of people can tell you what compression is. It's volume automation. So when something passes a certain threshold, it turns it down by a certain amount. So I knew that for years, yet compression is one of those things where as simple as it is, it's super elusive, and gaining the knowledge and the know-how and to be able to wrap your head around how to use it can take some producers years and years and years. Like for me, it did for sure. So I'm going to kind of explain it in this corny kind of metaphoric way that I hope can help you the way it kind of helped me visualize and think about compression. So we have little Timmy here who is up in his room, and mom hears the music and she says, turn that down. So she tells him to turn the radio down, which at this time is playing at 0 decibels. So it's playing metaphorically at 0 dB. And she's saying, turn that down by -6 dB. So turn it down this much. So what he does is it takes him about 0.3 seconds to go to the radio and turn it down. He turns it down by -3 dB. So he's turning it down half as much as she said to turn it down. So then after his mom leaves, it takes him 0.3 seconds to go to the radio and turn it back up. And he turns it back up 3 dB, so it's back at 0. So the threshold is the amount at which his mother tells him to turn it back down by. So once it gets to a certain amount, that's when she says, okay, this is too loud, you need to turn it down. And in this example, that's 0 dB. So that's known as the threshold, or the amount in which the mother is prompted to tell him to turn it down at. The ratio is the amount that he turns it down in relation to how much he is asked to turn it down by his mom. So in other words, she says turn it down, and she wants him to turn it down by -6 dB. If he turns it down by -3 dB, that's half. That's a 1 to 2 ratio. So remember, the higher the ratio, the more he turns it down to where he is asked. So in instance, if it was like a 1 to 10 ratio, he's actually turning it down not by 1/10, but to 1/10 of where the threshold is. So just think the higher the threshold number, the more compression. So a limiter is like an infinity to 1 compressor. So what that's doing is that's not letting anything, any part over the threshold. So the attack is how fast he starts turning the music down from when he's asked. So if she tells him to turn it down and it takes him 0.3 seconds to go into the radio and turn it down to that amount, that's how fast the attack is. And the release is how quickly he turns it back up after the mother leaves. So if it takes him 0.3 seconds to go and turn the radio back up to 0 dB, that's the release. So what does this all mean, and how can we kind of use all of this? So basically, what we're doing when we're compressing in music is we're trying to get a more even dynamic range so everything can be louder and more consistent. One of the main ways you're going to be using compression is with vocals. So the reason we compress vocals is because, say I'm a singer right now and I'm back here and I'm quiet, and then I'm up here and I'm talking loud. It's quiet and it's loud and it's quiet and it's loud. We want it to be consistent. We want it to be a consistent volume range. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, once sound gets this high, let's turn it down. And we don't just want to turn it down all the way because that's going to sound unnatural and that's going to squish the sound. So to make it sound more natural, we're using a threshold and a ratio. So we're saying once it gets past this amount, let's turn it down by like half. And again, the attack is how fast it starts turning down, and then the release is how fast it lets go after. Again, the objective is to decrease the dynamic range, or the difference between the loudest part of the sound and the quietest part. So here's an example of an uncompressed sound versus a compressed sound. So an uncompressed sound, it has all these super crazy transients and super crazy peaks. It's all over the place. If we listen to this, it's going to be loud, then super quiet, loud, then super quiet. And then compressed, what we're doing is we're taming all those peaks, and now in relation to the rest of the sound, everything's more even. So this will allow us to have a more consistent volume level, and as a result, be able to increase the overall volume of the sound. So because we don't have these crazy peaks here, we can now turn this sound up. So we're basically bringing the quiet parts up to the louder part. So again, vocal compression. When we're working with vocals, the artist will often be more or less quiet in certain parts of the recording. With compression, we can tame the large peaks of audio, and as a result, we can turn it up the entire vocal, resulting in a more even and consistent dynamic range. So we're just looking for something like this, a little bit more even, a little bit more rounded out. So drum compression is a little bit different, because when we're working with drums, unlike vocals, it's not a smoothly moving waveform. We have super high transients, so we have those super high and sharp peaks. So this is going to be a different kind of compression. So oftentimes drums are compressed to give us a fatter and bigger sound. The drums will have more body, but the more compressed, the less transient we have, or the less snap. So the right amount of compression here is key. So if we have a super fast attack, so as soon as the sound comes in, we're compressing it, then that's going to kind of dull our transient. So there's a lot of balance there we'll talk about later, but that's just something to keep in mind. So parallel compression consists of mixing in the compressed, usually heavily compressed signal with the dry and uncompressed signal. This results in drums or transients that are both transient heavy and snappy, as well as has body. This is how you accomplish punchy drums. So basically what this means is, if we super overcompress something, if you think about it, like if we take something and we just destroy it with compression. So we like the threshold super low, so anything that's coming in, like most of it's coming in and it's just completely turning it down. We're gonna have one sound with like drums that's super compressed and super consistent. That completely takes away and squashes our transient. So if we do that and then we mix that in with the transients, we have like that body, that super thick part, and then we have the transient. So parallel compression is a really cool trick, mostly for drums and other stuff too, to kind of like have your cake and eat it too. So multiband compression is also a very prominent way to use compression. Multiband compression applies compression in different settings to different parts of the frequency spectrum. This is a great tool for if you need to only compress specific frequencies. Ableton's stock multiband dynamics is a good example of this. So a time you would use multiband compression would be, say we have a sound and only the mids is bouncing up and down super quick. So we have like super loud mids and then it's quiet, and the lows and the highs are consistent. That would be a time where we would use multiband dynamics. So multiband dynamics are very commonly used, again, on vocals, because we can treat each frequency spectrum different. So if they need different kind of types of compression, we can do that. A special mention to Ableton's OTT is a famous preset that's grown a lot of popularity in dubstep and across all different types of music. So house music, bass music. Basically what it does is it's using upward compression, so that's known as expansion, and downward compression, and it's just completely squashing a sound, so it's now this kind of block. And what you can do then is you can kind of shape it how you want. Great way to make stuff super loud. So glue compression is when you use compression to kind of glue stuff together, in the sense that you put glue compression on a group or maybe on a drum loop, and now what you can do is you can compress everything together to give it a similar dynamic, similar transient information, and get the volume levels of everything closer to each other. So now that we have a pretty good idea of what compression is, let's hop into Ableton and take a look at some examples. So here we have a drum loop, and what we're going to do here is some glue compression. So we're going to grab an Ableton glue compressor, which this glue compressor is really good, by the way. It's modeled after an analog glue compressor, and a lot of people really like this one. There's a good sound to it. So when approaching compression, especially glue compression, the way that I do it is I will start with a fast attack, a fast release, and a low ratio. So basically we're starting at less compression, and then what we're going to do is we're going to play it until we see gain reduction. So what that means is the threshold's at 0, so anytime this needle moves here, the sound is louder than 0. And so one of the things that really kind of helped me understand compression is this device called Compressor Buddy. Link in the description, and basically how it works is it'll show you the transients. For a long time I had a hard time hearing what compression was actually doing. It can be very subtle, but if you can actually see it, then that helps a bunch to kind of see what you're doing. So as you can see, once we turn it on, these little peaks are just turning down a little bit. And the more threshold we introduce, you'll see how everything's turning down a little bit. And now it's closer in dynamic range. So the quietest sound is closer to the peak of the loudest sound. Now we would typically crank up the makeup gain because we turned down those loud peaks, and now we want to turn it back up so everything can be loud together. So it's subtle, but now what we have is we have a more even dynamic range. Everything's a little bit compressed. Another thing about compression is when we're turning something down, once it's passing a certain threshold, then what we're actually doing is we're giving the transient more space at the top of it. So that means that it's actually making the drums a little bit more punchy. So if we like squash this right here, we can see how much more body these drums have. So that's one situation where we'd use glue compressor. I pretty much always put a glue compressor on my groups. This is also a good way for like your mids and your basses. So what you want to do is you want to get everything close enough in volume to where then you can compress. Because the thing is, if you compress and volume levels are super far off, that's going to cause problems for you, because now as much as you turn everything else down, now you have to compensate by that by turning everything else up that much more. So you want to get your sounds as close to volume as possible before compressing, then use a compressor, and it's going to just fix those little details on top of everything. So that's glue compression. Next, we're going to look at levels of compression on a drum loop. And this is a compressed version of it. And this is a super compressed version. So notice we have a little bit of like clipping, a little bit of distortion there. Look how heavily compressed this is. This is like almost like a stick of butter now. And look how much fatter our snares are. So we typically wouldn't want to compress this much, but I wanted you guys to be able to hear the difference of what a compressor is doing. So louder. And the other thing about compression like this is you got to be careful, because we don't want all of our sounds to be the same volume levels. So what we hear in this situation is now our hats are way louder than we wanted them to be, because we're compressing this so hard that all the volume levels are like matched across all the different elements. So that's something to think about. So we're going to look at a snare in different phases of compression on the snare. So the first one has no compression, and then we're continually adding more. So what you're hearing here is, first off, we can see that this transient here is a lot bigger. There's a lot more transient information. It's not as sharp here. Next, we have a little bit of reverb here. We can almost barely see it on the first sample. But again, what we're doing when we're compressing is we're turning everything down so we can turn everything back up. So every time we turn this down, this little tail is getting louder, because we're turning this down and then turning everything back up. Turning this down and then turning everything back up. So this peak right here is getting bigger, and we're also bringing all this reverb up to a point where now this is just super, super compressed, and this reverb is just huge. So this is an example of how overcompressing something can be super bad. Also, you can totally blunt your transients to a point where it's just flat and it doesn't sound good. So too much compression is a lot worse than no compression. Overcompressing stuff is going to completely drain the life out of your track. So that's just something to be mindful of. Typically, compression is going to be something that's kind of light and surgical. So next, we're going to go over some vocal compression. So in this situation, we have an uncompressed vocal. I think this is kind of a silly one that a student sent to me. And then we have a compressed version. So already we can see here the difference. So we have this huge peak right here.
Trenches, I grew up, I had no one else. In the trenches I grew up, I had no one else. It was just me and myself. I got all my crew on me like Gorilla Glue.
So the problem with this is we have this huge peak here. So if we were like putting this in a track, it's not going to be consistent. And that's going to cause us a bunch of problems with our mix, because our vocal is this volume level the whole track. And then we have this. So it's going to pop at our listener. It's going to be too loud. It's going to cause a lot of problems. So we want that consistent volume level. So now here's a compressed version.
In the trenches I grew up, I had no one else. In the trenches I grew up, I had no one else.
So listen how more even the volume level is overall.
In the trenches I grew up, I had no one else. In the trenches I grew up, I had no one else.
But there's a caveat to that, especially with this particular example. And that is that, remember, as much as we turn the top down, that's how much we have to turn everything else up. So if we have what's called the noise floor, so basically here, like a little bit of noise, white noise, air conditioner, fan, whatever it is, or just room tone. In the snare example up here, that's going to continually be turned up. So we really want to be careful of that. So before you compress vocals, if there's anything outstanding like this, you should first do volume automation. So I would come in here with a utility, and if we just have like a couple rogue peaks like this, we're just going to come in and manually turn them down.
Cause I grew up, I had no one else. Cause I grew up,
So this is a little bit tedious, but to get pro quality audio, we don't want to overcompress because again, we're bringing up all the quiet parts here. So this would be something that a learned engineer would do on vocals is before going in compressing, like just address these peaks that are way high. That way we don't have to compress everything that much. We just have to compress a little bit to get everything a little bit closer. So that's kind of what we're after, something like this. And again, this even has some peaks we would address, but we want something like this where like it's pretty even all around. So as far as vocal compression goes, especially kind of in like the higher tiers of music production where you're getting some super high quality vocals, pop vocals. In genres where the vocal is like the star of the track, you really want that vocal to be as high quality as possible. Then you get into vocal compression, which there are a lot of analog emulated compressors that people love for vocals. And there's a couple of them, one of them being the 1176.
Fuck it.
So this is modeled after an analog compressor, and this is just one where people really love the sound of it. So typically when you're doing vocals, a 4:1 ratio is a good starting point. So like with drums, especially transient heavy materials, if we want to tame those transients, we want a super quick attack, and sometimes we want a little bit more aggressive of a ratio. But the thing with vocals is they're not transient heavy. There's not like a big spike typically. So they're a little bit more smooth. So because of that, we want typically a slower attack to make it sound more natural. And then we want a lower ratio. So usually 4:1 is a pretty good starting point with vocals.
Fucking with my gang. We popping off the big skate, hopping off.
So this is a VU meter, and this is showing us the gain reduction similar to like the glue compressor. And again, we want to, attack on 0.3 is good. Release on 0.7 is good. Release, you can set that to automatic a lot of the times. And then we're just getting a little bit of that gain reduction. I'm not a big compressor snob myself. On all of the stuff I've done, I'll either use Ableton glue compressor. Pro C is also a really good one, but a lot of people really like these analog emulated ones. So 1176, this is just a version of the 1176. There's a bunch of them. So probably one of the most famous analog compressors is the LA2A. And this one, again, is modeled after an analog compressor, so one that's a physical compressor. And it's a tube-based compressor. And this, again, it's just one that people love the sound of. People use it on vocals a lot. They use it on instruments.
Fucking with my gang. We popping off the big skank. Get hopping off of my lane. I know these bars I got are insane. Fucking with my gang. We popping off the big skank.
So again, we have, input gain, peak reduction.
Fucking with my gang. We popping off.
So all compressors have the same settings, which we went over, and we'll kind of review again real quick with an Ableton's regular compressor. And this is Ableton's stock compressors. So this is just a regular run-of-the-mill compressor. Ratio, so
fucking with my gang.
How much it turns it down in relationship to where the threshold's at. This blue line is the threshold, so that's this number changing right here.
Fucking with my gang.
So if it was at infinity,
fucking with my gang.
It's not letting anything pass this blue line. 1:1,
fucking with my gang.
It's not acting at all. 4:1, it's just turning it down that much.
Fucking with my gang.
Threshold, ratio, attack, how fast it kicks on. So if this is way over here,
fucking with my gang.
See how long it's taking to kick on. It's not even compressing all the way. Versus a super quick attack.
Fucking with my gang.
It's kicking on right away. Another thing to note is if your attack is too fast, it can cause clicking. So I usually like to leave this at like 0.3, 0.2.
Fucking.
And then the release is how fast the compressor turns off after.
Fucking with my gang. We popping off the big skank.
So see if it's all the way up, then it's not really ever releasing the compression.
Fucking with my.
Auto does a pretty good job, so you can turn it on auto and
fucking with my gang. We popping off the big skank. Get hopping off of my lane. I know these bars I got are insane.
So on this compressor, Ableton stock compressor, peak means that it's adjusting to the peaks.
Fucking.
So I thought that's what it was always doing, but when it's on RMS, it's actually reacting to the overall loudness, which is good because sometimes your loudness can be different than your volume. And when that's the case, you want it to react on the loudness. You don't want it to necessarily go off the numbers. So it comes on RMS. It's a good idea to leave it on RMS. Then expand is upward compression, which is kind of unique. So instead of pushing everything down,
fucking with my gang,
anything past the threshold is now boosting up. So that's kind of another topic. But yeah, this is the Ableton style compressor.
Fucking.
We can kind of, it gives us different views. So the knee is how aggressive the ratio is.
My gang, we popping off the big skank.
And we could see like the gain reduction here. So we have this view. I like this view though, where you can actually see the waveform. So that's the Ableton stock compressor. A couple other notable compressors is the Pro C is really good. So this again is a Fab Filter one, big surprise.
Fucking with my gang.
And the thing with compressors again is they all have the same controls. They just have different sounds. So this one has some really good sounds, some really good presets. This is the one that I use on my dialogue when I'm doing stuff like this. This is kind of my go-to compressor, just an overall good sounding compressor. And then one more notable compressor we'll talk about is the Fairchild compressor. So this is one, again, modeled after an analog one, but this is like the most highly sought after analog compressor. The Beatles use it on like a bunch of their stuff, and it just had that sound. That's really the only way you can really explain the fascination with analog gear is just has that sound. People just like it. And these plugin versions do a pretty good job of emulating the analog version. So it's just up to taste. And then, you know, if you're in a studio, sometimes you'll see an Avalon, which I don't believe they make a digital version of. So this is one right here that you will see in pretty much every studio. And that's because people just love it for vocal compression. It's still made in analog. People absolutely love it. And it just compresses your vocals going in, so you don't even have to do it in the box or in the DAW. So that's a pretty comprehensive overview of compression. It's really just one of those things where I can sit here and tell you the ratio and the threshold and attack again and again and again and how to use them, but really you kind of just have to get in there and compress and just listen very critically to gain your bearings and kind of understand how to use it. So again, it's a multi-tool, gluing everything together, decreasing the dynamic range, making your drums fatter. It can do a lot of stuff. So hop in there, you know, play around with Ableton stock compressors. Those compressors are fire. When in doubt, use less compression because you want to maintain your dynamic range and your transients. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next module.